Yeah. Mm, Thanks, Nadia, for agreeing to like share your expertise with us. Not really expertise, but like to agreeing to talk what you are passionate about with AFPC, and we are really keen to know certain aspects of your interests regarding British colonization and decolonization, and of course partition of India that happened in 47. So I would like to ask you if you can just start by speaking about yourself, what you do, just briefly your background.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Nadia, obviously, and I am a PR professional. An accredited PR professional. I've been working in communications and PR for about 15 years or so, and I'm currently working within the climate emergency sector for local government. And part of my role is to work with communities of global majority backgrounds, seldom heard communities, about trying to make them more aware about climate change and support them to take positive, sustainable behaviors, but at the same time acknowledging that there's huge climate inequality. So, working to remove barriers in that respect as well. But I'm also a historian by training. I have a BA and an MA in history from School of Oriental and African Studies in London and the University College London. And my speciality is Indian partition. I've also done other subject areas, but that's where I focus my dissertation topics on. So I would say that I'm passionate about history, especially this area, about different cultures and communities. I set up a project in 2020 called Golden Threads, which is about documenting and sharing shared Muslim heritage, but also diverse stories and tackling inequalities, promoting diversity and inclusion. And I also have a YouTube channel where I interview prominent academics and authors about various topics around belonging and identity. And I also am a freelance writer, and I've had several published articles. So, yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Right, right. Really interesting, actually. And while we, pause talking about British colonization, it was really interesting when I was talking to you last day about how, I mean, what sparked your interest in, partition. And if you would like to tell the story once again.
Yes, so I I fell into history almost accidentally. Obviously, my family have been affected by partition. My mum and my dad are from North India, and then my mum's family had to go as refugees to Pakistan. They went to Karachi. My dad's family remained in India, and so we are still separated from my dad's family, especially, and it's difficult to go and see them. And then I was, slightly aware of certain history, but not fully. I always loved history at school. So at school back then, you studied mainly like the world wars and industrial revolution, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, that kind of thing. And I've always liked the past and finding out the way people did things and how that relates to modern day. So then I was going to study French at university, and then it so happened that I ended up, one could say maybe it was fate that I studied history instead. And because I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies, I was presented with so many different interesting topics that we hadn't really studied at school. So, Indian history, Middle East, colonialism, and I also got a chance to study a bit of Urdu as well, and I studied Urdu poetry. So I felt that when I started to study the history of India and specifically around partition, I just felt I was, absorbed me because I didn't know so many things, and then a lot of things started to make sense, and it was a way to explore my identity, my family's history, and then it just went from there. And I really loved it. I really loved studying Muhammad Iqbal, who is the national poet of Pakistan, but also he was actually Indian, and I just found the philosophy and the context that he wrote about just fascinating.
Right. Yeah. Um, through your years of engaging with South Asian history, and since South Asian history is well, unfortunately, completely entwined with British colonization. So how would what according to you are the very direct effects of partition, besides intergenerational trauma, I mean, inequality in almost every aspect of economic, social, and political facets, and classism, which we are still suffering from, because colonialism is actually a mindset that we have not been able to get rid of completely even today. Like almost 80 years have crossed after 47. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly. Everything that you just said. So, colonialism, what happened in India specifically, partition, all of this, the effects and the legacies are still with us to this day. So, growing up and going to school, I've lived in London my whole life. I was born in Pakistan, but I've been here since I was 2 months old. My mum grew up here, so we were very much British. I went to school here, and history is taught in a certain way, and there is very much a narrative that at the time was very pro Britain. Um, you don't get a contextual history, you don't get holistic history. You don't really hear about, with study Elizabeth the First, for example, and not hear about a major part of her reign, which was to have an alliance with the Ottoman Empire and the Moroccan Kingdom, because the Pope had excommunicated her from the church. And so then she basically, England was a small island and it was just left alone. They needed to trade and they needed to survive. And, at the time it was not financially in a good position. So she wooed the Muslim world. We weren't taught this, we weren't taught the connections. So I'd say that is a big legacy of colonialism, which is still with us, because this is not taught. It's still not taught properly. There's been more of a movement about decolonisation, but I would still say it's a long time since I was at school, but it's not compulsory to teach certain areas about the empire. And teachers get to pick and choose which subject area that they decide to choose. And if they have little knowledge, or maybe are institutionally like prejudice, or then they won't teach it. And that's, we have come across teachers. One of my brother's teachers actually ran a class that was very that was quite racist and Islamophobic in some of the context that he put to the children. And then my mum heard about it, so she challenged it. So this still happens, and we live in a diverse area in London, and it still happens. So the fact that we're not taught our history makes us feel that we were insignificant, that we are inferior, that we don't really belong here, that we're here. The British are doing us a favor to let us be here. So you're always on the back foot, and that will affect your chances in life, the opportunities that present themselves. So this is a very real impact of it. We learned that India pre-partition from the 18th century, Shashi Tharoor talks about this in his book Inglorious Empire, that so the stats were that India's share of the world economy at that time, 18th century, was 23%. And then when the British left, it had dropped to just over 3%. So basically, India was robbed, looted, depleted, whatever you want to say. But from being such a rich land with abundant resources and wealth, it basically was left in a poverty-stricken state. And a lot of the jewels and the heritage pieces were looted. We know this. We know that, especially in the UK, you can find a lot of these heritage pieces in museums and stately homes. The biggest and the most famous one is a Kohinoor diamond in the crown jewels, and that and now that's left an issue, because when we talk about decolonization and we talk about giving back these items to the lands that they came from, this still poses a problem, because where will that diamond go? There's a lot of claims on it now that all the land is divided, so it's not straightforward. So to me, it's produced a very divided society. It's left a divided society, a lot of hatred, a lot of tensions. You can't easily go between India and Pakistan, for example, and they're right next door to each other, and people have either families on either side of the border, or their ancestral homes are on different sides of the border, and you can't go because of all this mess that was created. The British also use that tactic of divide and rule, their famous tactic, and they used it well, because it's still there. They have really created divisions, and we know that before the British came, more or less people lived side by side, and it wasn't complete utopia. When we're not trying to make up history, but people lived side by side, they intermarried, they were friends, they were neighbors, and when they left, it's like people hated each other and wanted to kill each other. So I find that really, really sad. And the way that the British divided India as well, and that whole story of dividing the land in just 36 days in a rush, and leaving a year almost before they said they were going to leave, and causing mass confusion and a huge refugee crisis where 15 million people were displaced and 1 million people died. So there is so much that they have left behind. I would also say, like I said, at school, there's a lot of this anti-Indian, anti-Muslim narratives out there still. I still come across them, such as the British came to India to civilize Indians, and the British contributed to India and built railways and gave you education system and all of that, which I find really ridiculous, because who's to say the Indians, who were far superior when the British came, who's to say that they wouldn't have modernized on their own terms? Why did they have to modernize according to the ways of the West and the British? Like, I just find that ridiculous. They also imposed the English language on Indian people as the official language, and it was 1835, I think that's when they imposed English, and basically along with that they imposed their structures, their education system, their legal system, their governance, and that is still with us. That is still with us even after independence. We are still tied to those systems which don't necessarily work for us, because we're different people. We have our own history and our own heritage and our own geniuses. those ways for me, and you said that earlier, that colonization is not just a colonization of land, but also of minds. And if you always think that the British systems are the best and the British language and English is the best, then you will constantly feel that you're trying to be British and to be English or to be like them. And you will never get there because you're not, you're different, and you never be seen as equal. So then you're always chasing something and you're not happy in yourself and you feel inferior. So that colonization of the minds is here and now.
Right. I think you know, even like as citizens, we need this awareness that almost 80 years ago, under the British rule, we were subjects, but now we are citizens and not subjects anymore. So that comes with a lot of responsibilities and a lot of, grace as well. But this shift has not been very clear for, you know people who have, people and whose generations have been suffering under the colonial rule per se. So I was going to ask that, how it's South Asian history, and if South Asian history if is like taught in UK, but you already said that. So I think the next question is kind of two part. Since we are talking about decolonization, what according to you would entail the process of decolonization, whether in South Asia and among the diaspora as well? So that, and another one is, how according to you can we build awareness that is, that you are saying, is missing, that we are not, we, or like people, at least we are living in South Asia and have an idea, or are bound to have an idea by the time we are, 18 or something.
Mm.
But kids who have a South Asian origin, but they do not get the opportunity to know their own history. So how can we build awareness among them about their own history? So yeah.
Okay, so the first aspect about decolonization, I was thinking about this question, and I think it's really difficult. Because when I think about, well, how do we were under this, British rule for almost 100 years, but before that, the East India Company was in control anyway. So it's been hundreds of years, and how do we get ourselves into a position of feeling confident in who we are and getting ourselves out of that legacy and healing from the trauma? So, as I said in the previous answer, that while those structures are in place, I think it's very difficult to do that because we are in effect trying to model what the British are, and we have totally different land. We have different communities that that live in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and I think that we need to look at our own history and our own systems that we had and try to modernize based on those. We know that these systems that are in place, even in the UK, they maintain this structural inequality and discrimination, and not just in South Asia, but here as well, because we are still fighting racism, we are still fighting Islamophobia. So I've read some writers who are quite bold in their thinking, believe that while those structures are still in place, that's going to be difficult to achieve. And also, this capitalist society that we live in also maybe keeps all of that alive as well. Also, these structures are, they're old. Society's changed. Do we need to, we do need to look at them again, Um, when I speak about the UK, this system that we have still of labeling people and putting them in a box of either being black or Asian or white, and society is changed so much that I know so many people are very diverse, and their parents are from different places, and then their grandparents are from different places. So they often say to me, I don't know what box I fit in. And then your needs are then, if you're supposed to fit into one of these categories, which for me is a bit of a colonial tactic, which was made it easier for them to govern the masses, and it's still being done, then how are you actually knowing people as individuals? And in the UK, where we rely on services, public services, we're paying taxes and we rely on public services such as hospitals and schools. And how are these meeting our needs with such antiquated ways of dividing people? And that's part of the reason why I think these structural inequalities still exist. And that's one example. Also, the role of faith is also, India was also created as a secular state based on the British and the Western model, and Britain is a secular state, and which is which is fine. That's how it operates. But then there's this lack of understanding of faith communities and how faith plays a big role in the way people govern themselves as well. So I feel like that doesn't really fit in. And in the UK now, faith is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, as well as race and gender and sexual orientation and so on. But in practice, I don't see that in action so much. Also, our our view of human rights. So that's based on the Western model. And from when I looked into this, so that Enlightenment period around the 18th century, where these theories around freedom and equalities and um, citizenship was being discussed by philosophers such as Kant, and that is what our modern human rights system is based on, and our modern structures. However, when you read into this, those philosophers and theorists were actually talking about equality and human rights for white people, and it didn't include the global majority communities. So if we are still using those structures of human rights, but they don't really apply to the global majority, then that's just keeping inequalities and discrimination alive. And you see that in play with, for example, in Qatar, where they were hosting the World Cup. And yes, they have horrific LGBT abuses, and we call that out. But the narrative around it was very hypocritical, and it almost felt like, well, the West can do what they like and they can have abuses here, but when other people from different cultures and backgrounds do something, it just it's not a level playing field. And also, what the West see as the way of doing things and their culture and their way of life is often imposed on other countries and other people. So why is it that the West's way is the right way? And we see this globally. We see them interfering in other places still. So yeah, it's very complex, and people say, it won't happen overnight, but the first step is awareness, because when we're not aware of it, we just blindly go along. We think everything's fine because there's no obvious discrimination, and it's seen to be frowned upon in society. So it's not culturally acceptable, for example, to be racist. And so we tend to think, and I know people that think, oh, but we're, we're doing well here, we're doing well in the UK. And because on the surface, and you'll see representation in TV, for example, and magazines and billboards of people of color, and you think, oh, this is not bad. But when you dig a little deeper, not even that deep, there's still so much inequality. And for me, I feel like that pacifies people to think that things are changing, whereas there is a long, long way to go. And awareness for me and education and knowledge is key. So that leads me to your second part, which was around building awareness.
Yeah.
So when I talk to younger family members, or even friends about partition, and these are people who are maybe Pakistani Indian background, they don't know a lot about this history, and they don't necessarily see the connection between certain things that they are feeling around identity issues and all of that. They don't put two and two together. For me, it's very obvious that when we don't know and we're not proud of who we are as individuals, and a lot of our history has been either hidden or is presented in a way that is basically fake news,
Mm.
that obvious it's obvious to me that that's going to have an impact on how I feel about myself, how I feel about my community, how I see maybe white people in power that, oh, you can't challenge, and they're the best people for the job, that kind of thing. So I actually, that's why I've set up Golden Threads, is because I found that so many people don't know their own history, don't know their own story, their own family background, and all of that. So my my thinking around trying to combat that, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of academic books, but sadly, and there's a need for academic books because they're full of wealth of information, and it's all really useful, especially for people who want to research and write books. But if you're just somebody who's not really interested in all that academia, it can be off-putting. And I remember when I was studying history, sometimes those historical books were quite heavy. So we're busy, we're all working, we're trying to make ends meet, and we might have responsibilities. So are we going to really try and go through those books? So my goal in life is to make those books and those stories accessible. And
Right.
so I've been doing that by doing loads of book reviews. So I kind of do a summary in writing, but also
Hmm.
video, to give people a gist of the story, and then direct them to say, well, if you want to read more, this is the book, and they're my recommendations as well. And then I'll interview the authors from time to time as well. So that gives you a kind of overview about their key arguments and what they're
Hmm.
saying and their conclusions. So I definitely
Hmm.
think making history accessible and relevant to people, so connecting it
Yeah.
to now, because I had a comment on social media. Somebody said, I must have posted something about a review or an article, and they said, oh, it was about William Gladstone's family who are apologizing for slavery. And somebody said, when are you going to let this go? That was over 100 years ago. They think it's in the past. Why are you still
Yeah. Hmm.
talking
Hmm.
about this? And
Yeah.
my response was, because this is still with us. It's still with us. The legacy, the structures, the power imbalance is still with us
Hmm.
here and now. So history is not irrelevant. History has a direct link to us here and now.
Hmm.
We need to
Hmm.
know who we are. We need to know the unbiased narratives. We need to learn it for ourselves. And with that, I feel, and it's happened to me, you become more confident in yourself and who you are and your
Mhm.
sense of belonging. And that just, and then you're unapologetically you.
Yeah.
And if we are all empowered that way, I think that will go a long way to redressing some of the imbalance that's out there. But when we don't know anything, and as we, as the younger people come up, that link to our grandparents and what they went through with partition will, there'll be a bigger gap. And then there are still some people who lived through partition, but in the future,
Absolutely.
that's not going to be there. So
Mhm.
what is what is their understanding going to be like in the future? And my fear is that if it's lost and that connection is lost, then those people are lost. So it's really important that we make this history accessible, that we document those stories from individuals who have
Mhm.
been through the horrors and
Mhm.
the tragedy of partition. And I had an event a couple of weeks ago actually, which was about untold partition stories.
Yeah.
There was a lady who wrote a book about her father's experience of partition and the family experience. And then we opened the floor for other people to
Mhm.
share. And there was an auntie there that lived through that time. She was about 10 and she shared. And these stories need to be written down.
Right.
There
Mm.
is an archive. There's a 1947 archive that
Yes.
I've come across recently. And
Mhm.
also, there's an Everyday Muslim archive as well about partition stories. So it's about that, just trying to redirect people to that, and we shouldn't lose this connection, because
Mhm.
it's a massive link to
Mm.
who we are and our identity and our sense of self.
Right. Yeah. I think all equalities are like that. I mean, when we see on the surface, like when I teach kids, and when I talk about gender equality in the society, they're like, but girls work nowadays, and yeah, I mean, uh, there is no problem there. Apparently there is no problem, and girls can do whatever they want just like we can, little boys. But like there is so much more to it, and then I have to go back to centuries back when this
Yes.
all started. And while I'm talking about this, it's really sad that some teenage boys, they, I don't know, they have probably witnessed the darker side of social media, and then they kind of imbibe all the toxic masculine traits, and they see feminism as something which is problematic and something which can potentially harm them in some way or the other. So
Yes, I've seen
I
that.
do have a hard time, dealing with these kids.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
social media, it's a blessing in some ways, but there's a lot of issues out there, especially for
yeah,
younger people. I didn't grow up with social media. It was more when I was at university. And now it's great because for me at the moment, because I can link up with people all over
yeah.
the world. Like, for example, with you, you're
Mm-hmm.
in India, I'm here, we have a similar interest.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
been because of the power of social media and technology and all of that.
Mm.
So in this line of work, it's brilliant. But
Yeah,
there is
yeah.
a lot of abuses and there is a lot of toxicity
Mm.
out there. And especially for young people, I
Yeah.
feel it's really important for them to have some sort of trade, like resilience, education and training when
Mm.
using the internet, because it's really
Right.
worrying.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, social media does play a huge role in what you were talking about, like making history accessible to the masses, and also to make history relatable, and not always come with a lot of jargons, and heavy words, and just make it lucid for people to understand, for laymen to understand. That, I mean, people who don't really come from historical or social science backgrounds, even
Mm,
they can relate to the historical topics that we are trying to talk about. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I recently, so the event I told you about, and then I did one for my work for staff,
Mm, mm,
and I tried to put partition into a simple 30-minute presentation.
right.
And it's doable. You've just got to,
Mm,
how at the beginning I just said, it's obviously a very complex history,
right.
but just to give an outline, because what you do is you spark people's interest,
Mm,
and then they can go off, because there's so many different angles you can go into. Then they can go off, hopefully, once they're interested, and study more. But when they
mm,
don't know anything and they just think it's irrelevant,
mm,
then you'll never get them interested. So I think, like, all these, even TikTok, with
mm,
the very
mm.
short
Yeah.
sound bites of various topics, and I actually use it to do some of my reviews on there. And I did a short video on Tipu Sultan,
Mm,
the ruler of Mysore,
yeah.
and one of the last strong opponents against the British in
Mm,
India. And I went to the V&A Museum, where his famous toy tiger is mauling a
yeah.
British soldier. And then I made it into like a video with different, like, graphics and things like that. And it was viewed a lot. And then what you can do then is send people to different resources or different articles. So there is a value in it in some ways. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think, to, like you said, because these days people don't have that concentration span,
Yeah.
which is worrying, because it's very much about, and I work in communications, and how people digest information now is in short snippets, and video content is very, very popular.
Mm-hmm.
So if you write too much, people will
No one
scroll.
is going to read it.
They're not going to read it. You put a lot of effort in, and so there's different mediums. For me, social media is, I will do short, small content, but if people want to, if they're interested, because some people are interested in more detail, then you send them
Yeah.
to a longer video or an article or something like that. But this is what we also need to be aware of, because society is changing. And if we're talking about getting more people to learn about history and what's happened in the past, then we've got to be aware of this changing dynamic. But
Mm-hmm.
what I really like, and I don't know if you are aware of this show called Horrible Histories in the UK, and it's basically for children, and it's a comedy farce about British history. So, for example, there's not just British history; they also do like ancient Egyptians and different periods in time. But there's one series which is called The Terrible Tudors, and they teach a history in a really funny way that engages with young people. And my nephew and niece, who, when they were into it, they were both under 10. They knew so much about history, more than adults, because something went in, because they used a medium that would capture their attention. It's
Right.
funny. They have
Mm-hmm.
music. And then we were doing a quiz. We were playing a game, and there was a quiz, and they knew all the answers to the history questions. So I thought, that's actually,
That's
there's
great.
something in
Yeah.
that. There's something in that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about figuring out the ways to tap into people's interests. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's what it is.
And it helps me, because I have a comms background.
Mm.
That's actually helped me to get this information out to a wider group,
Mm-hmm.
because I have those skills anyway for different campaigns that I've worked on. Right now,
Right.
it's climate change. So it's been really useful, actually, to have that as as my as my sort of basic skills, to then
Mm.
use that to try and engage people. And it's always changing. Now we've got AI and we've got Chat GPT, so
Mm-hmm.
it's about always trying to keep on top of that.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Um. So coming to decolonization and then reparations, the idea of reparations, what in your opinion should ideally entail reparations, and um, and how can reparations be used to repair the damages that has been caused by partition, or the long 200-year British rule in India?
So so this is something that I haven't focused on that much, the reparation part. And then when I met James Boston from the Association of Former British Colonies, and he raised it with me, and I thought it's really interesting actually to think about. Well, how could how could the British give back basically for what they've taken? And I've read a few things around it as well. And initially, I always thought it was like an economic reparation, or giving the people who went through partition and their descendants, a bit like with slavery, like money. That's what I initially thought it entails, but there's so much more to it. And one of the things that Shashi Tharoor says in Inglorious Empires, which I found interesting, is that he said no amount of money in the world could ever reverse the effects of colonization and partition and what the British did in India. And I kind of agree with that. No amount of money could fix that. But what I think that can be done and should be done is, firstly, that there needs to be more awareness in the mainstream about what the British Empire did and the Western world did around, with colonization in different parts of the world, slavery, and these things need to be not romanticized. They need to be told factually, and I think at school as well, this needs to be obligatory for everyone to learn about what the British Empire did for and other empires, because so many people are so ignorant of it, and they don't see what the big deal is. So when there are people like us talking about the effects of colonization and slavery on us now, and why it's still leading to structural inequalities and even health outcomes and things like this from intergenerational trauma, that's a real thing. Often people don't understand, or they think you're just ranting, or just leave it. Why are you causing trouble? And you're why don't we just all forget it and just move forward, because that was in the past. So I think there is an issue where so many people don't know, and that needs to be addressed. And I know that AFBC are doing a lot of work around that, which is great and need to be supported. Also, in terms of removing debt, supporting ex-colonized countries to develop, and maybe having programs that help people, to scholarship programs and employment apprenticeships, things like that, to try to redress the imbalance. So I think those are some of the things, and obviously there are people who have done more study on this, but just at face value, I think those things would definitely help, but never ever um, remove that trauma that we went through, and what was taken um, from people who were colonized, and that's just really sad.
And funnily enough, like, the British people, they are still left to kind of formally apologize for
Yes,
everything.
yes. I was going to add that there's never, according to Shashi Tharoor, never been a formal
Yeah,
apology, and I don't understand why that is so hard,
yeah,
because we all know. I mean, generally, people, even if they don't know the details, they know that the British colonized India. You generally know that wealth was depleted. So why not just say sorry? That's not going to fix it. But if we're talking about
mm, mm,
healing, if we're talking about
mm,
the people that went through it and the generations after that, and then us in the diaspora, there is obviously a lot of trauma there. And how do we heal? And maybe that first step of actually taking ownership and apologizing would go a long way.
yeah,
And I can't understand. I mean, it's they don't maybe they don't want to formally admit. I just
yeah,
don't
yeah,
get it.
mm,
It's really confusing, because
mm,
that step, Shashi Tharoor says this as well, that that would go a long way. And
yes,
like I said about the descendants of William Gladstone, they're formally apologizing, and they're trying to own what
mm,
happened, and the legacy that their family has with slavery.
mm, mm,
So why can't governments do that?
mm, mm. I mean, even in surrounding the topic of Holocaust, several German leaders, I don't know about the government, but like several German leaders and political um, heads, they have formally apologized about whatever
Mm,
happened. And of course, it does not fix anything, but a genuine apology is
yeah,
sometimes gives the victims peace
yeah.
in some way or the other.
And I suppose it's that genuine part, isn't it? Because if you're just mouthing the
Yeah.
words, people can sense
Mm-hmm.
if it's not well intentioned, and if it's just for PR or to silence people. So they would have to really feel that. And
Yeah,
obviously that is not being felt. And why? Why isn't it being felt by certain people in power? What are they trying to what are they afraid of, or what are they trying to hold on to?
yeah. That is food for thought. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think this is like one of the last questions. Um, what policy changes or changes in outlook in general do you think is needed to promote peace between India and Pakistan? I mean, over the Kashmir issue that has been looming large for the last 70 years, 70, 80 years, that has been transferred into a perpetual war zone. And
Mm,
the
mm.
Kashmir issue is really unfortunate, and it has been going in several capacities till today, and like in the near future also we do not see any um, possibility of it getting solved in any way. So regarding that and various other aspects as well, what policy changes or changes in just looking at the issue and overall the whole process can facilitate peace between the two countries?
So yeah, very interesting question. Not my area of expertise, so I probably can't go into it in too much detail. But from a person that studied partition, and looking at it at face value, I think definitely that tension between the two countries is kind of, it feels like it's kept going because of the narrative that each of those states perpetuates, which is a bit like the narrative that we have here in the UK about the British Empire wasn't that bad, and did some good stuff. So I feel like both of those countries have their own narrative, and it's basically a narrative that promotes their existence, and is by nature sees the other side as the enemy. And and it, if they could look at it, and the historian Yasmin Khan says this in her book about partition as well, that if these countries could maybe just come out of that narrative for a bit and see people as humans and see that we've all been through trauma together, and we know horrible acts happened, and there was a lot of inter-religious fighting and killing, and we know that, but we also know that there was a lot of good good Samaritans that were helping people of other faiths, that were sheltering people, because in such a inhumane situation that was created by the British, I have to say, it brought out the worst in some people. That's and we need to realize that that's not everybody, and there were many people that helped each other, that still have connections across those two lands. We're not, yes, we are all individuals, and there's a lot of diversity. There was a lot of diversity in India before partition anyway, and there's so many different languages spoken there, and different cultures based on where you live. But we we were like we were Indian, and we live together, and we share some heritage. So if we could look at people as human beings and what they've been through, and let them tell their stories, because again, a lot of our elders didn't really talk about partition and the traumas of partition, and it feels like it was so deep that to speak about it would kind of be like to relive it. And also, were they asked their story? Were they given a safe space to tell their story without fear of somebody getting mad at them or not understanding them? So I think that we have to be able to tell our stories, and we need to be able to empathize with each other and what we've all been through together. And yes, we need to heal as communities on our own as well in that safe space, but we need to come together and also, give each other a big like hug, because it was so, one of the worst refugee crises and in the 20th century, and even Yasmin Khan calls it one of the darkest moments of the 20th century. So this is, and it's in our living memory as well. So it's quite recent if we talk about it in the scheme of things. So I think that empathy and letting go of these hostile narratives and trying to be a bit more balanced with the history that they tell is essential. And I feel like, in a way, to promote their existence as separate countries, this is kept going. But wouldn't it just be so much better if we could let go of that, and then we could travel between the lands, and see family, see ancestral homes. Now, I liked what Imran Khan did when he was in power, where he opened up the corridor for the Sikh community to come and visit their religious sites in Pakistan, and I know a few people that went, and that step went a long way in kind of removing barriers, and I think, those gestures are really important and key, to try and, maybe somebody extends a hand, extend the hand back. And I mean, it's worrying now because we know in India there's the right-wing government, and there's a lot of hatred and going on at the moment, and killings and stuff like that. So are we far away from sort of, coming together? It feels like we are really far away, but there's always hope. There's still always hope. And unfortunately, the issues that are still there with Kashmir, for example, and these all go back to the way that the country was divided, the British legacy. And I don't know what to say about that, apart from the fact that it's just really sad. and we see this sort of um, this in other countries as well, where there's been a legacy of colonialism. So that goes back to what we were talking about with how do we decolonize and how do we educate people. So it kind of goes back to that, because there are, I've heard people say, oh, these countries, your country's such a mess, and without knowing the context and why and what the role of the British and the Western countries were in doing this. So it kind of needs to be like a holistic approach.
And regarding the situation between India and Pakistan, the point is that those who make the borders, they do not let the people on either side to actually communicate and know that we are not so different.
Yes.
Which is the funny thing about borders, because the decision about borders is not taken by us, the common people. They do not take
No.
the decisions, and they are taken by people who are not directly affected by that.
Mm,
So that's what happened in during the partition as well.
yeah.
So
That
yeah,
concept of borders is actually really crazy as well, because the way the line was drawn, and
yeah,
you could
yeah,
be a village that was together, and then
yeah,
suddenly half of you on one side, half of you on the other side, but you all lived in one
yeah.
community. So that in itself, and sometimes, and that's what's happened with nationalism, it's actually created a lot more divides than what there
Mm,
was before. But that move towards nation states is like a modern phenomenon, but it doesn't always make sense. And there's a story that I spoke about in my talk. So Saadat Hassan Manto is a Urdu
mm.
Pakistani writer,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he wrote that story Toba Tek Singh.
Obatek Singh, yeah.
Yeah, where so this is about the aftermath of partition,
Mm,
and there's these inmates of an asylum
yeah,
that are in Pakistan but have been told that their homeland is now going to be in India. And then one
yeah,
of them, Bishan Singh, doesn't want to go because his home's in Pakistan, and he's traumatized and ends up dying on
yeah,
that no man's land between the two
yeah,
borders.
yeah.
And
It's a
that for me
beautiful short
really,
story.
really, it really captures the tragedy and the
Yeah,
sadness about it and the whole thing around borders.
right, right. Yeah. So I think that's what brings us to the end of the interview. Any concluding remark that you would like to make? Any plans about your uh, coming research interests? Anything?
Yeah, I am obviously interested in doing more work around this area. So one of the things that I'd like to explore further is actually my family's story. So I know that my mom's granddad, her paternal granddad, came to London in the 1950s, and he used to do business between Pakistan and
Mhm.
England, and he would drive between the two quite a lot. And he was living in 1950s in Old Street, an area which is now quite affluent in sort of more towards East London, Shoreditch area, and but at the time was a slum. So I really want to find out more about what he experienced and his story, and then weave that into a more stories of our family, and also my mum's other grandfather, her mother's father. His name was Khan Bahadur Maqbul Hussain. So he
Mhm.
was a minister, the finance minister in Oman, and
Mhm.
he worked for the Sultan Said bin Timur of Oman, and he played a really important role negotiating the handover of Gwadar to Pakistan. And he has actually written his own memoirs,
Wow.
and
Okay.
so as a family we want to delve into that more, and obviously I just want to make partition history much more accessible. I would like to write a book about this. I haven't decided what angle I'm going to go for, but that's something that I want to
Hmm.
do after my, because I have a book that's due to come out
Hmm.
hopefully in the next few months, and it's called Dance Histories: A Journey Across the Muslim Silk Roads, where I explore the connection and the shared heritage of dance along the Silk Road and its link to spirituality.
Hmm.
And it's a coffee table book, so there's lots of beautiful photos as well, but it's like a history book, stroke storytelling of different
Hmm.
people who are practicing these dances, now practitioners of dance and their stories, and also a bit about tracing the history. So that's due to come out in the next few months. And then after that, I really would like to do something around partition stories.
Amazing. Thank you for talking about your family history and about your general interest regarding what AFPC is working on, and thank you for your time, and mostly
Thank
because
you.
your interests and our interests, they kind of align, so that is the
Yes.
best part.
Yes, definitely. It's been
Thank you
it's been
again.
wonderful to connect with you guys, and now we know that we have this shared interest. Hopefully there'll be much more that we can do together to highlight this history and to try and
Right.
make things better for people and to get rid of structural institutionalized racism, discrimination and Islamophobia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you
I'll
so
just
much. It's been really
the
good.
record.